The heater in my old Ford gave out somewhere around mile 280, just past the Pennsylvania line. And I'll tell you what, at 68 years old with arthritis in both knees and a left shoulder that hasn't been right since 1987, that's the kind of thing that makes a man question every decision he ever made. The snow had started light around Harrisburg, just little flecks dancing in the headlights, the kind of thing that makes you think it'll pass. By the time I crossed into Ohio, it was coming down sideways, and the wipers on that old truck were working overtime, slapping back and forth like they were trying to wave the storm off the windshield. I kept driving. I'd promised my daughter I'd be there for Christmas Eve dinner, and I am not the kind of man who breaks a promise to his only child, even when his only child has been pulling away from him for the better part of 3 years. Let me back up a minute. My name is Edgar, and I spent 41 years building a company from nothing. Started out in a rented garage in Toledo with 2 used welding rigs and a phone that took messages on a little cassette tape. By the time I sold the controlling interest 2 years ago, that company had 1,100 employees across 4 states and contracts with 3 of the biggest aerospace firms in the country. The sale put a number in my bank account that I still have trouble saying out loud: $340 million after taxes. My wife passed in 2019. Breast cancer took her in 11 months from diagnosis to the funeral. We were married 36 years. After she was gone, I didn't have much use for the money. I'd already moved out of the big house in Perrysburg, sold it, gave most of the furniture to her sister, bought a little ranch on 2 acres outside of a town you've never heard of, drive an old truck I've had since 1998, wear the same flannel shirts I wore when I was running the shop floor. Money never meant much to me. Building something meant something. The people I built it with, they meant something. The money was just paper. My daughter is named Cordelia. Her mother picked the name out of a Shakespeare play she read in college, and I went along with it the way you go along with most things when you're a young father holding a baby for the first time and you can't believe a thing that small is yours to keep. Cordelia is 41 now. She married a man 8 years ago, fellow by the name of Brock Whitfield. Works in something he calls private equity, which as best I can figure means he buys companies that other people built and then sells them off in pieces. They have a daughter, my granddaughter, my whole heart in a small package, and her name is Junie. She's 6. She has her grandmother's eyes, and the first time I held her in the hospital, I cried right there in the maternity ward, and a nurse brought me a tissue and said it happens more than you'd think. The trouble with Cordelia started maybe 3 years ago, not long after my wife passed. Brock had been pleasant enough at family dinners, in the way that a man can be pleasant when he's measuring you the whole time. After the funeral, he started calling me. Just checking in, he said. Wanted to make sure I was eating right, getting out of the house, all that. Then the calls turned to questions. Did I have a financial advisor? Had I thought about estate planning? Did I have a will? And if I did, when was the last time I updated it? He had a friend, he said. A wonderful estate attorney out in Chicago. Would I like an introduction? I have a will. I had a will when Cordelia was 2 years old, and I've updated it 3 times since. The current version was drafted by my own lawyer, a man named Mort, who I've known since 1981 and who I trust with everything I own and most of what I think. Mort handled the company sale. Mort handles my charitable giving, which is significant and which I don't talk about because the whole point of charity is that you don't talk about it. I told Brock thank you, but my affairs were in order. He smiled and said that was wonderful to hear. Then he asked very casually, just curious, what arrangements I'd made for Junie. As her grandfather. Long term, you know. Something in me went cold that night. I didn't say anything to Cordelia. I drove home and I called Mort the next morning, and I told him what had happened. And there was a long pause on the line, and then Mort said, Edgar, I think we need to have a conversation about some additional protections. Mort and I spent the next 18 months very quietly putting things in order. A trust structure for Junie that her parents cannot touch. A living trust for me that no one knows about, with provisions that kick in under very specific circumstances. A cognitive baseline test done annually by a neurologist in Cleveland, documented and notarized, so that if anyone ever tried to argue I wasn't of sound mind, We'd have 8 years of medical record to slap down on the table. We also did something else. We made me look poor. This is not as hard as you might think. I'd never been showy. I still drove the old truck. I still lived in the little ranch. I started turning down dinner invitations to Cordelia and Brock's place in Shaker Heights, and asking instead if they'd come out to my place, where I'd serve them pot roast on plates we'd had for 20 years. I started complaining, gently, about the price of groceries. I mentioned the arthritis more than I needed to. I let it be known, in a way that wasn't quite saying anything, that the company sale hadn't gone quite the way the family had assumed. There'd been debts, obligations to longtime partners, a handshake deal with a co-founder that had eaten up more of the proceeds than anyone realized. By the second Thanksgiving after the sale, I think Cordelia genuinely believed her father was worth about $2 million, all in and shrinking. I was not proud of any of this. I want you to understand that. There is no version of this story where a father is proud to test his own daughter. But I have spent my whole life around money and around people who want money, and I know what it does to people who haven't earned it. I needed to see who my daughter had become. I needed to see who I'd be leaving Junie with when my time came. So that brings me to the night of December 23rd, last year, in a snowstorm somewhere in eastern Ohio with no heat in the cab and my knees on fire and the wipers fighting the windshield. The drive from my place to Cordelia's house in Shaker Heights should have been 4.5 hours. It took me almost 7. I pulled into their driveway just before 9 at night. The house was lit up like a magazine spread. They have one of those big stone places, 4-car garage, professional landscaping that costs more in a month than I made my first year in business. There were cars in the driveway, a couple I recognized, a couple I didn't. They were having a party. Cordelia had told me dinner would be just family. I sat in the truck for a minute, rubbing my knees, watching the snow pile up on the hood, and I'll be honest with you, I thought about turning around and driving home. But Junie was in that house, and I had presents for her in the back seat, wrapped in the same red paper I've used for 40 years, because I bought a whole pallet of it in 1984 from a printing company that was going out of business. So I got out of the truck. I walked up the long driveway in my old work coat and my boots that were leaking salt and snow, and I went around the side the way I always did. Because the front door was for the people Cordelia wanted to see. The side door opens into a mudroom that opens into the kitchen. I came in quiet, the way you do when you don't want to interrupt a party. I could hear voices in the kitchen, women's voices, my daughter's, and another. I recognized as her sister-in-law Tabitha, Brock's sister, who I have never liked and who has never liked me. They were laughing. They were laughing the way women laugh when they've had 2 glasses of wine and they think no one's listening. I stopped in the mudroom. I don't know why. Something in their voices. I stopped and I stood there, my hand on the door handle, snow melting off my boots onto the tile, and I listened. Tabitha said, "So is he coming or not?" Cordelia said, "He texted from somewhere outside Akron. He's coming." Tabitha said, "In that truck. In this storm." Cordelia laughed. She actually laughed. She actually laughed. She said, "I know. God, I hope his car breaks down. I am not in the mood for him tonight. I cannot deal with the sweater and the arthritis and the stories about the old shop tonight of all nights with the Hendersons here." Tabitha said, "Brock thinks tonight's the night." Cordelia said, "Brock thinks every night's the night. He's been thinking that for 2 years." Tabitha said, "But the papers." Cordelia said, "The papers can wait until after New Year's. Honestly, Tab, the man is so out of it half the time, I don't think he'd notice if we slid them across the table tonight. But not in front of the Hendersons. Not on Christmas Eve. Even I have some limits." They both laughed. Then Tabitha said, "And Junie? What are you going to tell Junie when he just, isn't around?" Cordelia said, "Junie barely knows him. He shows up twice a year with cheap presents and asks her about kindergarten. She'll forget him by spring. I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you are 68 years old and you have driven 7 hours in a storm with a broken heater and screaming knees, and you are standing in a mudroom holding a bag of presents, and you hear your only child say those words. Junie barely knows him. She'll forget him by spring. The man is so out of it half the time. The papers can wait. I did not cry. I want you to know that. I have cried in my life. I cried when my wife was diagnosed. I cried when she passed. I cried the morning I sold the company, sitting in the parking lot at 6 in the morning before any of the lawyers got there. But I did not cry in that mudroom. Something else happened. Something cold and very old and very steady moved through me, and I felt every one of my 41 years of business decisions stack up behind it like a wall. I set the bag of presents down on the bench in the mudroom. Very quietly, I turned around. I walked back out the side door, back down the driveway, back to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute. Then I took out my phone and I called Mort. Mort picked up on the second ring. He said, "Edgar, it's 9 at night on December 23rd. What's wrong?" I said, "Mort, I need you to do something for me. I need you to do it tonight." He said, "Tell me." I said, "You remember the protocol we put together, Section 4. There was a pause. Then he said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm sure." He said, "Where are you?" I said, "In my truck, in their driveway. I haven't gone in yet." He said, "Don't go in. Drive to the Marriott downtown, the one on Public Square. There'll be a key at the desk in your name. I'll call you in the morning." I said, "Mort, there's one more thing." He said, "Anything." I said, "Junie." He said, "We've got Junie." We've had Junie since the day we set the trust. Drive to the Marriott. I drove to the Marriott. The truck made it. The heater didn't come back on, but the truck made it 24 miles to the snow and the salt and the empty interstate, and I parked it in the valet line at the Marriott on Public Square in downtown Cleveland. And a young man in a red coat looked at the truck and looked at me and started to say something, and I handed him the keys and a $100 bill, and I said, "Take care of her. She's been good to me." There was indeed a key at the desk in my name. The young woman at the front desk looked at her screen, looked at me, looked at her screen again, and said, "Mr. Edgar, you're in the presidential suite." Mr. Lindquist called ahead. "Is there anything we can have sent up?" I said, "A pot of coffee and a turkey sandwich." She said, "Of course. Will you be needing anything else?" I said, "A new suit. Charcoal gray. 42 long, 36 waist. White shirt, 16.5 neck, 35 sleeve. Black shoes, 11.5 wide. By 9 in the morning." She blinked. She said, "Yes, sir. We have a relationship with a tailor on Euclid. I'll make a call." I said, "Thank you, sweetheart. And a haircut. Whoever you can get up here." I went up to the suite. It was bigger than the first apartment my wife and I lived in. I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at my hands, which were red and cracked from the cold and from 41 years of work. And I said out loud, "To no one, I'm sorry, kid." I don't know if I meant Cordelia at 41 or Cordelia at 8. Sitting on the workbench in my shop, eating an orange while I welded a railing for a hospital cafeteria, I think I meant both of them. I think you can mean both of them. I think you can mean both at the same time. I slept 4 hours. The coffee came up at 6. The tailor came up at 7. A small Italian man named Sal who took one look at me and said, "Sir, you have the shoulders for this. We will make you beautiful." The barber came at 8. By 9:15, I was in a charcoal suit that fit me better than anything I'd worn since my wedding, with a fresh haircut and a shave, and I looked in the mirror and for a minute I didn't recognize myself. Then I did. I recognized the man I was when I closed the deal with the city of Detroit in 1994. I recognized the man I was when I signed the papers to buy the second plant in 2001. I recognized the man my wife married. He'd been there the whole time. He'd just been wearing flannel for a few years. Mort called at 9:30. He said, "Edgar, I have a few things to tell you. Are you sitting down?" I said, "I'm standing in a presidential suite in downtown Cleveland, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck. I think I can take it." He said, "Brock Whitfield has been moving money. I've had a forensic accountant on this for 14 months, ever since you and I had our talk. He's been setting up shell companies in Delaware and Nevada. 3 of them, as structured to receive disbursements that he's been planning to argue after the fact, were authorized by you under power of attorney." I said, "I never signed a power of attorney." Mort said, "Correct. But he had a document drawn up. It's sitting in his desk in Shaker Heights right now. Your signature is on it. The signature is forged. We have the forensic comparison. We have the notary who signed it, a man named Petrov who has been disbarred twice in 2 states and who is currently the subject of an investigation in Cuyahoga County that he doesn't know about yet." I said, "And Cordelia." He said, "Cordelia signed an affidavit attesting to your declining cognitive function 3 months ago, in her own handwriting. It's part of the package. She would have argued when the time came that you were no longer competent to manage your own affairs." I said, "And what do you have, Mort?" He said, "Edgar, I have 8 years of cognitive testing showing you in the 95th percentile for your age group. I have your signature exemplars. I have the forged document. I have the shell companies. I have the disbarred notary. I have your daughter's affidavit, which is going to look very interesting in a courtroom next to the medical records. I have, in short, everything we need." I said, "What do you recommend?" He said, "There's a Christmas Eve party tonight at their house, 6 o'clock. The Hendersons are going to be there. Walter Henderson is a senior partner at the firm Brock has been trying to get hired into for 2 years. I said, "How do you know that?" He said, "I know that because the Hendersons are also clients of mine. Edgar and Walter and I had drinks last Tuesday, and he told me Brock had asked him for the 3rd time. Walter doesn't like Brock. Walter has never liked Brock." I said, "Mort." He said, "Yes." I said, "I'd like to attend that party." He said, "I thought you might." I had the hotel call a car, not the truck, a car, a black Cadillac with a driver named Reuben who'd been working that hotel for 19 years and who treated me, in the suit and the haircut, exactly the way he would have treated any other man in a charcoal suit getting into a black Cadillac on Christmas Eve. I tipped him $100 at the start of the evening. I told him I might need him for a while. I had Reuben drive me first to the bank. Mort had arranged things. I picked up a leather portfolio with several documents inside, sealed in clear envelopes, and I had the bank's notary on standby for a phone call. Then I had Reuben drive me to a jewelry store on Chagrin Boulevard, where I picked up a small wrapped box that Mort had also arranged and which I will tell you about in a minute. Then I had Reuben drive me to Shaker Heights. We pulled up to the house at 6:15. The driveway was full. I could see through the front windows that the party was in full swing. Cordelia in a green dress. Brock in a blazer holding court with 2 men I assumed were the Hendersons. Tabitha, Brock's sister, by the fireplace, laughing at something. Junie nowhere in sight. I asked Reuben to wait. I walked up the front steps. I rang the bell. Brock answered the door. He had a drink in his hand. He looked at me. His face did 3 different things in the space of about 2 seconds. The first thing it did was not recognize me. The second thing it did was recognize me. The third thing it did was try to hide the second thing. He said, "Edgar, you made it." I said, "I made it, Brock. May I come in?" He said, of course, come in. Let me take are you wearing?" I said, "A suit, Brock. I'm wearing a suit. It's Christmas Eve." He stepped aside. I walked into the foyer. Cordelia came around the corner from the living room, holding a champagne flute, smiling the smile she puts on for people she wants something from. Then she saw me. Then her smile did the same three things her husband's face had done, in roughly the same order, only slower. She said, "Dad." I said, "Hello, sweetheart." She said, You look." I said, "I know." I had a little help. Behind her, Walter Henderson stepped into the foyer. Older gentleman, white hair, sharp eyes. He looked at me. He looked at Cordelia. He looked back at me, and a small smile started at the corner of his mouth. He said, "Edgar Caldwell, is that you?" I said, "Walter." "It's been a long time," he said. 20 years. The aerospace conference in Phoenix. You gave the keynote." I said, "I did." Cordelia's face was doing something I had never seen it do before. She was looking back and forth between me and Walter Henderson, like she was trying to do math that wouldn't add up. Walter said, "Edgar, I had no idea you were Cordelia's father. She's mentioned her dad, of course, but Caldwell. Of course, Caldwell Industrial. My God, my firm did the structuring on your sale." I said, "I know, Walter. Mort speaks very highly of your work." Brock was standing very still. The drink in his hand was tilted just slightly, and a small amount of bourbon was running down over his thumb. I said, "Cordelia, where's Junie?" She said, "Upstairs." She's watching a movie." "Dad, what is?" I said, "Would you ask the babysitter to bring her down? I have a present for her. Then I'd like to talk to you and Brock for a minute." In the study. "Walter, would you join us? I think you'll find this interesting." Walter said, "I would be delighted." Brock said, "Edgar, whatever this is." I said, "Brock, we can have this conversation in the study, just the family and Walter, or we can have it right here in the foyer with everyone listening. Your choice." He chose the study. Junie came down in her pajamas, the red ones with the reindeer, and when she saw me, her face lit up the way it always did, and she ran across the foyer and hugged my legs, and I bent down, knees screaming, and picked her up, and she put her little hand on my cheek and said, "Grandpa, you smell different." I said I had a fancy shower, Junebug. She giggled. She put her head on my shoulder. I carried her into the study. Cordelia followed. Brock followed. Walter followed. The babysitter, a young woman who'd clearly figured out something was happening, stood in the doorway. I asked her to take Junie for 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, and then I'd bring her back myself. The babysitter took Junie. Junie waved at me over her shoulder. I waved back. I closed the door of the study. I set the leather portfolio on the desk. I opened it. I laid out the documents one by one. I said, "This is a forensic accounting summary of 3 shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada over the past 16 months. Brock, your name appears on the incorporation documents of all 3. This is a forged power of attorney bearing my name, notarized by a man named Alexei Petrov, who is currently the subject of an open investigation by the Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct. This is the forensic handwriting analysis showing the signature on this document is not mine. This is the affidavit you signed, Cordelia, 3 months ago, attesting to my cognitive decline. And this is my cognitive baseline test from October, certified by a board-certified neurologist, showing me in the 95th percentile for my age group, which is to say sharper than most people in their 40s. The room was very quiet. Walter Henderson said, "Oh dear." Brock said, Edgar, there's been a misunderstanding." I said, "Brock, don't. Just don't." Cordelia sat down in the leather chair by the desk. She set her champagne flute on a coaster. Her hands were shaking. She said, "Dad." I said, "I heard you, Cordelia. Last night. In the kitchen. With Tabitha. I came in through the mudroom. I heard everything you said." She closed her eyes. I said, "I want you to know something. I want you to know that I am not a poor man. I have never been a poor man. The company sale netted $340 million after taxes. I have lived simply because I prefer to live simply. And because your mother and I agreed, when we had nothing, that if we ever had anything, we wouldn't let it change us. It did not change me. It changed you." She started to cry. I did not stop talking. I said, I have spent the last 2 years watching you and your husband try to figure out how to take everything I built. I have let you. I wanted to see who you were when you thought no one was looking. Last night I found out. Today I am doing what your mother would have wanted me to do, which is to make sure that her granddaughter Junie is taken care of, and that the two of you are nowhere near the money. Brock said, Edgar, please, whatever you think. I said, Brock, the county prosecutor has a copy of everything in this portfolio. So does the IRS. Mr. Petrov is going to have a hard time of it in the next few weeks. So are you. I am not pursuing criminal charges against my daughter at this time because she is my daughter, and because Junie needs at least one parent at home. But you, Brock, you are going to have a hard time of it. Walter, I imagine, is also no longer interested in your application to his firm. Walter said, Brock, I want you to understand that I have, as of right now, no further professional interest in your career. Brock sat down on the leather sofa. The bourbon was still running down his thumb. I said, Cordelia, there is a trust for Junie. It was established 2 years ago. It is administered by my attorney, Mort Lindquist, and by an independent trustee in Cleveland. You and Brock cannot access it. You cannot influence it. When Junie turns 25, she will have more money than she can spend in a lifetime. Use wisely. Until then, the trust pays for her education, her health care, her housing if necessary, and a modest allowance for her care, paid to whichever guardian is appropriate. She said, Whichever guardian. I said, I am not taking your daughter from you, Cordelia. Not today. But I want you to understand that there are conditions on the trust. The trustee has visitation rights. There will be checks. There will be evaluations. If at any point ever the trustee believes Junie is being used as leverage against me or against the trust, custody arrangements will be reviewed. I have made sure of this. Your mother's lawyer made sure of this. My lawyer made sure of this. There is no version of this where you get to use my granddaughter to get to my money. She was crying hard now. I did not enjoy it. I want you to know that. There is no part of this story where I enjoyed watching my daughter cry. I said, and there is one more thing. The will. The new will which Mort drafted in October and which is now executed. There is no inheritance for you, Cordelia. Not directly. The estate, what remains of it after charitable bequests, passes into the trust for Junie. You will receive nothing. I am sorry. I love you. I will always love you. But I cannot reward what I heard last night. I will not. I picked up the small wrapped box from the desk. I walked over to her. I put it in her lap. I said, This was your mother's. It's the locket I gave her on our 10th anniversary. I had it cleaned. I want you to have it. I want you to look at it sometimes and remember who she hoped you'd be. I walked out of the study. I walked through the living room, past the party guests who had no idea what had just happened, past Tabitha by the fireplace, who took one look at my face and set her drink down very carefully. I walked up the stairs. I found Junie in the playroom with the babysitter watching a Christmas movie. I told the babysitter she could go. I sat down on the couch next to my granddaughter. She climbed into my lap and put her head on my shoulder. She said, Grandpa, are you staying for Christmas? I said, Junebug, I'm staying for as much of it as your mama lets me. She said, I drew you a picture. It's a reindeer. His name is Pancake. I said, Pancake is a wonderful name for a reindeer. She said, I love you, Grandpa. I said, I love you, Grandpa. I said, I love you, Junebug. I love you more than the whole sky. I sat there with her for 45 minutes, watching a movie I didn't follow, holding my granddaughter and listening to her breathe. Downstairs, I could hear the party slowly figuring out that something was wrong. Voices getting quieter. People making their excuses. The Hendersons left early. I heard Walter say goodbye in the foyer, and I heard him say, quietly, to Cordelia, You have a remarkable father. I hope you remember that. When the movie ended, I carried Junie down the stairs. She was half asleep. I gave her to Cordelia in the foyer. Cordelia took her without a word. Her eyes were red and swollen. The locket was in her hand. I said, "I'll call you next week." She said, "Dad." I said, "Next week, sweetheart." I walked out the front door. Reuben was waiting in the Cadillac. The snow had stopped. The sky over Shaker Heights was clear and cold and full of stars. I got in the back of the car. Reuben said, "Where to, sir?" I said, "Take me back to the hotel, Reuben. I think I'd like a sandwich." He pulled out of the driveway. I looked back once. The lights of the house were still on. Through the upstairs window, I could see a small shape moving, my granddaughter, being carried to bed. I watched until the car turned the corner. Then I closed my eyes. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said. I thought she would have held my hand and told me I'd done the right thing, and that she was proud of me, and that Junie was going to be all right, and that Cordelia, given time, might find her way back. I don't know if she'd have been right about that last part. But I know she would have said it, and I know I needed to hear it. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between loving someone and protecting yourself from them? Have you ever had to be the only adult in the room when the room was full of people you raised? I'd like to know. I'd like to know. I'd like to know. I'm not the only one. I've thought about that night 1,000 times since. The cold cab of the truck. The snow on the windshield. The sound of my daughter's laugh through a closed door. And the thing I keep coming back to, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, is that none of what happened to me happened by accident. Every step of it, mine and hers, was the result of choices made years before any of us knew we were making them. I spent 41 years building a company because I believed work was a moral thing. You show up, you do what you said you'd do, and you treat the people next to you like they matter. I thought I'd taught my daughter Cordelia the same. I thought it would take, but here's what I learned the hard way, standing in that mudroom on Christmas Eve. You can give a child every advantage in the world, and if you don't also give her hardship, she will grow up believing that comfort is something she's owed instead of something other people paid for. That's not her fault, not entirely. That's mine too. Her mother and I, we wanted her to have it easier than we did. We forgot that easier is not the same as better. What I did to Brock and to Cordelia in that study, with the documents on the desk, that wasn't revenge. I want you to understand that. Revenge is what you do when you're hurt and you want to hurt back. What I did was something else. It was a kind of accounting. Every dishonest thing she signed, every shell company he set up, every quiet conversation they had about my cognitive decline, those were causes. The consequences had to come. Not because I willed them to, but because that's how the world works. You forge a signature. The signature gets found. You sign an affidavit you know is false. Someday someone produces a real one. The papers always catch up to you. I've watched it happen in business for half a century. It's the most reliable thing in life, after love and weather. The thing I want to leave you with, the thing I'd say to my younger self if I could, is this. Protect what you build, but don't be afraid to look at it honestly. If the people you love are showing you who they are, believe them the first time. Don't wait for the 7th hour in the snowstorm. Don't drive through the cold with a busted heater hoping you misheard. You didn't. You never do. And when the moment comes to stand up for yourself, and for the small person upstairs in the reindeer pajamas who can't stand up for herself yet, stand up. Your knees will hurt. Your hands will shake. Do it anyway. That's what dignity is. Not the absence of pain, the willingness to act in spite of it. Junie is going to grow up knowing her grandfather chose her. That's worth every mile I drove.